Good afternoon everybody and welcome to the stream. I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games and today we are going to continue with our usual Wednesday poetry, prose and riddles stream. So we finished last week on this poem by John Keats, To Autumn. This individual is, or was, John Keats, an English poet of the second generation of Romantic poets, with Lord Byron and Percy Shelley. Although his poems had been in publication for less than 4 years when he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25, they were indifferently received in his lifetime, but his fame grew rapidly after his death. So, unfortunately, he died tragically young. But that is who he was. As usual, I will begin the stream by rereading the last poem that we finished on, so To Autumn, and then after that we will move on to poems that we haven't looked at yet, which we will look at in much more detail. So, the rereading of last week's poem, To Autumn. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close-bosomed friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the moss cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells, with a sweet kernel to set budding more, and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has overbrimmed their clammy cells. Who have not seen thee oft amid thy store, sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, and thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers, and sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thy music too. While barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue, then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows borne aloft, or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. So, that was To Autumn. Interesting poem, especially the personification of autumn as an individual lying on the ground I thought was interesting. Anyway, the first new poem that we're going to look at this week, new as in we haven't looked at it before, is Ode on Melancholy. So I will proceed with the first reading. No, go not to Lethe, neither twist wolfsbane tight-rooted for its poisonous wine, nor suffer thy pale forehead to be kissed by nightshade ruby grape of Proserpine. Make not your rosary of yew-bearers, nor let the beetle nor the deaf moth be your mournful Psyche, nor the downy owl a partner in your sorrow's mysteries. For shade to shade will come too drowsily, and drown the wakeful anguish of the soul. Sorry, I seem to be making quite a few mistakes. But when the melancholy fit shall fall, sudden from heaven like a weeping cloud, that fosters the droop-headed flowers all, and hides the green hill in an April shroud, then glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, or on the rainbow of the salt sand wave, or on the wealth of globbed peonies, or if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand, and let her rave, and feed deep upon her peerless eyes. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, and joy whose hand is ever at his lips, bidding adieu and aching pleasure nigh, turning to poison while the bee-mouth sips. Aye, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine. His soul shall taste the sadness of her might, and be among her cloudy trophies hung. Again, as with a lot of John Keats poetry, I feel like there's a lot to unpack here. I note immediately that we have this unusual... Do I mean unusual? I suppose I mean irregular rhyming structure. So we have rhymes between twist and kissed and wine and Proserpine. But then berries rhymes with mysteries much lower down. Owl and soul. Bee I don't think rhymes with anything. Oh, bee and drowsily. Of course they rhyme. As I understand it, John Keats began trying to write sonnets, and sonnets have a particular... Well, there appear to be several families of sonnet, different ways of writing a sonnet, and John Keats seems to have, after being dissatisfied with the existing structures for sonnets, invented his own. And I assume an ode on melancholy is no different. So there is a structure here, but it is unique to his writing so far as I'm aware. And that would apply both to the rhyming scheme and the rhythm of the piece, I believe. Normally we would look in more detail at those, but I'm no expert on the subject, and I'm satisfied, based on what I've learned, to say that there is a rhythmic structure, there is a rhyming structure. It's a variation on a sonnet invented by John Keats. What I will do is what we've been doing with a lot of John Keats poetry, is see if there is a Wikipedia page for the poem we're reading, because Wikipedia seems to contain pages on a lot of his poetry, and they naturally do a much better job of explaining it than I ever could. Which isn't what we had been doing very often up until we got to John Keats' work. Usually I would do my best to analyse it based on what little knowledge I had, but as I say, his poetry is complex and dense, and so I find it's best to look at the Wikipedia page. So, Ode on Melancholy is one of 5 odes composed by English poet John Keats in the spring of 1819, along with Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on Indolence, and Ode to Psyche. The narrative of the poem describes the poet's perception of melancholy through a lyric discourse between the poet and the reader, along with the introduction to ancient Grecian characters and ideas. Ideals. While studying at Ensfield, Keats attempted to gain a knowledge of Grecian art from the translation of Tooke's Pantheon, Lempriere's Classical Dictionary, and Spencer's Polymetis. Although Keats attempted to learn ancient Greek, the majority of his understanding of Grecian mythology came from the translations into English. Ode on Melancholy contains references to classical themes, characters, and places such as Psyche, Lethe, and Proserpine. In its descriptions of melancholy, as allusions to Grecian art and literature were common among the 5 great odes. Psyche I have certainly heard of. Psyche is the Greek goddess of the soul and often represented with butterfly wings. Psyche was commonly referred to as such in Roman mythology as well. The direct translation is Anima. She was born a mortal woman with beauty that rivaled Aphrodite. And I remember the legend. I wasn't aware that she had been promoted to a god, or a goddess I should say, But the story essentially is that who was it? One of the lesser deities fell in love with her, but Aphrodite was Eros, that was it. When Aphrodite's temples were deserted because people started worshipping Psyche, the goddess was outraged at what was being worshipped over her. As a punishment, she sent her son Eros to make Psyche fall in love with a vile and hideous person. However, Eros fell in love when he saw Psyche and decided to spare her from his mother's wrath. I won't go into the full detail of the legend, since that seems probably off topic for this discussion of Ode on Melancholy. But long story short, Aphrodite was not happy with the events that happened, tried to punish Psyche, but ultimately, Psyche and Eros were allowed to be together. Now the other two, Lethe and Proserpine, I do not recognise. In Greek mythology, Lethe, also referred to as Lemosine, was one of the 5 rivers of the underworld of Hades, also known as the Amyles Potamos, which I'm probably mispronouncing horribly, river of unmindfulness. The Lethe flowing around the cave of Hypnos and through the underworld, where all those who drank from it experienced complete forgetfulness. Oh, that's very interesting. My understanding was that was the river Styx. And if you drank from the river Styx, you would completely forget everything that had come before, and that's how it was that those departed would end up moving on from their past lives as mortals, because they, at some point, they'd have to drink from the river Styx, and at that point they would forget everything. But this seems to be suggesting it was the river Lethe. Lethe was also the name of the Greek spirit of forgetfulness and oblivion, with whom the river was often identified. In classical Greek, the word Lethe, which I'm probably mispronouncing horribly, literally means oblivion, forgetfulness, or concealment. It is related to the Greek word for truth, aletheia, I think, again, probably mispronouncing it, which through the primitive alpha literally means unforgetfulness or unconcealment, or privative alpha, sorry. Okay, according to this, the river Styx is the river that separates Earth from the underworld. I won't look up the river Styx right now, since it isn't mentioned in the poem. That could be considered off topic. But I find it very interesting that the legend I associate with the river Styx is actually the river Lethe. So we also have Proserpine. Proserpine is an ancient Roman goddess whose iconography, functions, and myths are virtually identical to those of Greek Persephone. Persephone was the goddess who was the daughter of the goddess of spring, whose name I have forgotten, and the legend goes that it was I think it may have been the Roman goddess of the harvest, but either way, the Greek goddess of the harvest, sorry, these are all Greek gods I'm thinking of, Persephone and the others. Anyway, the legend goes that she, Persephone, the daughter, was stolen away by Hades, I believe it was, to marry her, but for reasons, she couldn't stay. If a mortal goes to Hades, and then I think it drinks or eats anything, they cannot leave, ever. In the case of the goddess of a deity, in this case, apparently she was able to leave for half the year, 6 months. And the story goes that her mother, who I believe was the god of the harvest, I'd have to double check that, would go into mourning for 6 months of the year, and that's why we have the seasons. Before then, apparently, it was like a perpetual sort of like spring, summer, and autumn combined, where there was just, always verdant growth, and you could always find food to harvest and so on. But then after this incident, when she was stolen away and married off to, I think it was Hades, because she was in the underworld half the year, her mother would be in mourning half the year, hence we get the seasons. And this seems to be suggesting that Proserpina, or Proserpine, is the Roman equivalent. So Proserpina replaced or was combined with the ancient Roman fertility goddess Libera, which I'm probably mispronouncing, whose principal cult was housed in the Aventine temple of the grain goddess Ceres, along with the wine god Liber. Each of these 3 deities occupied their own cellar at the temple. Their cult was served or supervised by a male public priesthood. Okay. Let's have a quick look at Persephone to see if I'm right about the legends. Is the daughter of Zeus and Demeter. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, I think? Harvest and agriculture. Yep. She became the queen of the underworld after her abduction by her uncle Hades, the god of the underworld. While Persephone was picking flowers from a field, Hades burst through a crack on the earth, driving his chariot, and snatched Persephone as she cried for help. Her mother Demeter searched long for her with no success before being informed that Hades had taken her to be his queen, with the approval of Zeus. Persephone was not allowed to return to the world above until Demeter prevented all plants from growing, causing a famine and forcing Zeus to demand that Hades let her go. I think it's when it says Persephone was not allowed to return to the world above until Demeter prevented all the plants from growing is badly written. I don't think it means she wasn't allowed until Demeter did this terrible thing, as in this is the condition for her coming back. I think it means she was not allowed to return to the world, so Demeter prevented all the plants from growing, and as a result of that, Zeus was forced to demand that Hades let her go. Persephone, however, consumed some pomegranate seeds while in the underworld, and having eaten food from Hades' realm she could not leave. Zeus settled this by decreeing that Persephone would spend some months in the underworld with her husband and the rest of the year above with her mother. Yeah, so it looks like I was thinking of the correct legend. So, Proserpina was officially introduced to Rome as the daughter of Ceres in the newly Romanized cult of mother and daughter. The cult's origins lay in southern Italy, which was politically allied to Rome but culturally a part of Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. The cult was based on the women-only Greek Thesmothoria, which was a part public and part mystery cult to Demeter and Persephone as mother and maiden. It arrived in Rome along with its Greek priestesses, who were granted Roman citizenship so they could pray to the gods with a foreign and external knowledge, but with a domestic and civil intention. The best known myth surrounding Proserpina is of her abduction by the god of the underworld. Her mother Ceres' frantic search for her, and her eventual but temporary restitution to the world above. In Latin literature, several versions are known, all similar in most respects to the myths of Greek Persephone's abduction by the king of the underworld, named variously in Latin sources as Dis or Pluto, and in Greek sources as Hades or Pluto. Hades can mean both the hidden underworld and its king, the hidden one, who in early Greek versions of the myth is a dark, unsympathetic figure. Persephone is Kore. Sorry, I don't know why I pronounced it like that. Since I know it's not Japanese, is Ko, possibly, the maiden, taken against her will. Okay. I think that's enough of that. So we know who Psyche was. She was the originally mortal. Apparently she became a goddess who Aphrodite took a disliking to, sent her son to make her fall in love with someone hideous. He then fell in love with her. Long story short, they were allowed to be together in the end. Left the river of forgetfulness, and Proserpine, who was the Roman equivalent of Persephone. Am I pronouncing that right? Persephone. I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but anyway, who was the goddess that was stolen by Hades, daughter of Demeter. The whole situation ultimately leads to the seasons. So, back to reading through the Wikipedia article on the poem, Ode on Melancholy. Unlike the speaker of Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale, and Ode to Psyche, the speaker of Ode on Melancholy speaks directly to the reader rather than to an object or an emotion. With only 3 stanzas, the poem is the shortest of the odes Keats wrote in 1819. However, the original first stanza of the poem was removed before the poem's publication in 1820. Well, we're looking at the poem as published, so we'll read this bit. According to Harold Bloom, one can presume that the harmony was threatened if fully half of the poem was concerned with the useless quest after the melancholy. Despite its adjusted length, Keats thought the poem to be of higher quality than Ode on Indolence, which was not published until 1848 after Keats' death. Interesting. Structure. Ode on Melancholy consists of 3 stanzas with 10 lines each. Because the poem has fewer stanzas than Ode on Indolence and Ode on a Grecian Urn, the rhyme scheme appears less elaborate, with the first and second stanzas sharing a rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, C, D, E, C, D, E, while the third takes on one of its own, A, B, A, B, C, D, E, D, C, E. As with Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode on Indolence, and Till Autumn, each stanza begins with an A-B rhyme scheme, then finishes with a Miltonic sestet. The general meter of the poem is iambic pentameter, so that's generally the meter he was going for. I don't know what Miltonic sestet is. Could that be a reference to Milton, the author of, what was it called? The great work I can't remember the name of. No reference to Miltonic sestet. May have nothing to do with it, but no. Not what I was asking Wikipedia. But for my own benefit, I'd like to double check the name of the work. Paradise Lost, that was it. Which was in fact an epic poem, so that supports my theory that a Miltonic sestet could be an allusion to Milton. The Romantic poets valued his exploration of blank verse. Blank verse is poetry written with regular metrical but unrhymed lines, almost always in iambic pentameter. It's been described as probably the most common and influential form that English poetry has taken since the 16th century. But for the most part rejected his religiosity. William Wordsworth began his sonnet London 1802 with Milton, "Thou should have been living at this hour," and modelled the prelude, his own blank verse epic, on Paradise Lost. John Keats found the yoke of Milton's style uncongenial. He exclaimed that Milton's Miltonic verse cannot be written but in an artful or rather artist's humour. Keats felt that Paradise Lost was a beautiful and grand curiosity, but his own unfinished attempt at epic poetry, Hyperion, was unsatisfactory to the author because, amongst other things, he had too many Miltonic inversions. Okay, so what I'm taking away from this is there is a great deal of jargon which presumably describes very specific things and are probably useful terms when analysing poetry, which I don't know and which don't all seem to have articles on Wikipedia. I'm not saying they should, but they're not there, so I won't be looking them up right now. But that's worth being aware of. So, where it says each stanza begins with an A-B rhyme scheme, then finishes with a Miltonic sestet. I don't know what a Miltonic sestet is, but since we just read that John Keats thought that Paradise Lost was a beautiful work, and that was written by Milton, and in the quote from John Keats it used the word Miltonic, I think altogether we can conclude that is a reference to a structure that Milton was using in his works. Right, so back to the Wikipedia article on Ode on Melancholy. Personification is implemented with words such as joy, beauty, delight, and pleasure, allowing the poet to create characters out of ideals and emotions as he describes his thoughts and reactions to feelings of melancholy. The difference between the personifications of these words and those in the other odes Keats wrote in 1819 comes from the fact that while the poet describes them as human, he declines to interact with them. Keats himself fails to appear in the poem, which creates what Andrew Bennett describes as a separation between the author and poet and the reader. In Reading Voices, Garrett Stewart reaffirms Bennett's assertion that Keats' voice never appears in the poem itself when he says, "For all the florid stagginess of his conceits, there is, in short, no mention of writing of the melancholic as a writer." Negative capability appears subtly in Ode on Melancholy, according to Harold Bloom, who describes the negative in the poem as being the result of a carefully crafted ironies that first became truly evident as the poet describes the onset of melancholy through an allegorical image of April rain supplying life to flowers. The use of the droop-headed flowers to describe the onset of an ill temper, according to Bloom, represents a passionate attempt by the poet to describe the proper reaction to melancholy. In the original first stanza, the Gothicising of the ideal of melancholy strikes Bloom as more ironical and humorous, but with the removal of that text, the image of the droop-headed flowers loses the irony it would otherwise contain, and in doing so subverts the negative capabilities seen in Ode to a Nightingale. Yet Bloom states that the true negativity becomes clear in the final stanza's discussion of beauty. The final stanza begins, "She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die," which he suggests supplies the ultimate case of a negative relationship because it suggests that the only true beauty is one that will die. But Thomas McFarland, while acknowledging the importance of the original first stanza to Keats' endeavour, openly praises the removal of the lines as an act of what he calls compression. McFarland believes that the poem's strength lies in the ability to avoid the seemingly endless wordage of endymion, and that's the final stanza. That's incidentally another one of Keats' poems which isn't in this anthology, and lets the final stanza push the main themes on its own. By removing unnecessary information such as the reason the poet suggests a trip to Lethe, Keats allows the reader to avoid the fancy aspects that would have appeared in the first line and were not sustained throughout the rest of the text. I think that's enough of that. So we've discussed both rhyming structure and rhythmic structure So let's move on to what will probably be the final reading. We have a lot more context from that Wikipedia article on what this poem is actually about, besides the obvious melancholy. So hopefully we will get more out of it this time. Things to keep in mind is that Lethe is the river of forgetfulness in Hades, the Greek underworld, ancient Greek underworld. That Proserpine is the Roman equivalent of Persephone, who was the goddess stolen away by Hades, the king of the underworld, and in a series of events leads to the seasons, and that Psyche is the mortal who Aphrodite became very jealous of. A bunch of events took place, and ultimately her son Eros ended up I don't know if they got married, but they ended up together. So, once again, Ode on Melancholy. No, no, go not to Lethe, neither twist wolfbane's tight-rooted for its poisonous wine, nor suffer thy pale forehead to be kissed by nightshade ruby grape of Proserpine. Make not your rosary of yew-berries, nor let the beetle nor the deaf moth be your mournful Psyche, nor the downy owl a partner in your sorrow's mysteries. For shade to shade will come too drowsily, and drown the wakeful anguish of the soul. For when the melancholy fit shall fall, sudden from heaven like a weeping cloud, that fosters the droop-headed flowers all, and hides a green hill in an April shroud, then glut thy sorrow on a mournful rose, or on the rainbow of the salt-sand wave, on the wealth of globbed peonies. Or if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand, let her rave, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, and joy whose hand is ever at his lips, bidding adieu and aching pleasure nigh, turning to poison while the bee-mouthed sips. Aye, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has her own sovereign shrine, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can verse joy's grape above his palate fine. His soul shall taste the sadness of her might, and be among her cloudy trophies hung. I feel as though I could spend quite a lot longer looking at this poem and drawing out additional meaning. But I also feel we should probably move on at this point because we've been looking at it for quite a while. So the next poem, also by John Keats, is La Belle Dame Sans Merci. So I think that would be the beautiful woman without thanks. Merci, I assume. So we will move on to the first reading. La Belle Dame Sans Merci. Ah, what can ail thee, wretched wight, alone and palely loitering? The sedges withered from the lake, and no bird sing. Ah, what can ail thee, wretched wight, so haggard and so woeful and so woe begone? The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest done. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheek a fading rose fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairest child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sideways would she lean and sing a fairest song. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me as she did love, and made sweet moan. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild and manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and where she gazed and sighed deep, and there I shut her wild sad eyes, so I kissed her to sleep. And there we slumbered on the moss, and there I dreamed, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamed, on the cold hillside. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all, who cried, La belle dame, sans merci, have thee in thrall. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke and found me here, on the cold hillside, and this is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering, though the sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Right, so let's begin by looking up any words we're not 100% sure about. And if there's any words you're not 100% sure about or just want to discuss, please put them in chat. I'm going to double check white, because I understand white to be a form of undead creature that preys upon the living, but a lot of that knowledge is based upon modern high fantasy. So it's worth checking exactly what they would have meant, if I can. Archaic, a living creature, especially a human being. Paganism, a being of one of the 9 worlds of heathen belief, especially a nature spirit, elf or ancestor. Poetic, a ghost deity or other supernatural entity, or fantasy, a wraith-like creature. Where did it come from? White person, creature, being, wit, thing, something, anything. Okay, sounds like it's an archaic word for a person or creature, which came to mean a ghost deity or other supernatural entity, although it's not entirely clear from this dictionary page why. So what I would conclude from that is that we should interpret white here more broadly than we would based on modern high fantasy. It's simply identifying some sort of supernatural being. Although a wretched white certainly implies negative connotations. The sedge. Now I believe sedge is a type of plant. Any plant of the genus Carax, are true sedges, perennial endogenous herbs, often growing in dense tufts in marshy places. They have triangular jointless stems, a spiked inflorescence, and long grass-like leaves which are usually rough on the margins and midrib. There are several hundred species. So that's what they mean by sedge. What would they mean by woe begone? I'm familiar with woe. Woe begone. In a deplorable state, filled with or deeply affected by woe. Beset by woe. Looks like it comes from began, to beset, to surround. Begone. Archaic, expressing a desire or a command for someone or something to go away. That's what I would have thought begone would mean. Past participle of bego. To go about, encompass, surround, beset. To affect, usually as a good or bad influence or as a circumstance. He was woebegone. Okay, so that's what it means. So haggard and so woebegone. What else do we have here? I met a lady in the Meads. What would the Meads be? I can only assume they don't mean... Oh, a meadow. Interesting. I was going to say, I can only assume it's not the drink. Fragrant zone. A band or stripe extending around a body. Okay, so it's probably just another fragrant zone. Is probably just a reference to some sort of ring of fragrant flowers or something like that. Manadu. Biblical food miraculously produced for the Israelites in the desert in the book of Exodus. Any boon which comes into one's hands by good luck. The sugary sap of the manna gum tree which oozes out from holes drilled by insects and falls to the ground around the tree. So these are found in Australia. See, when it refers to manadu, the temptation is to think they must be referring to the manna gum, since that makes logical sense. But given that it's an Australian plant, I doubt it. Oh, fruit of an elm tree. Oh, that's a different language. I apologise. That was the end of the English ones. The English definitions. I'm going to look that up in my physical dictionary. Manna, spelled with two N's, substance supplied as food to the Israelites, spiritual nourishment, especially the Eucharist, sweet juice from from manna ash, and other plants used as a gentle laxative. Manna croup, coarse granular wheat meal. Mana Ash. Native to southern Europe and southwestern Asia, from Spain and Italy north to Austria and the Czech Republic. Again, this seems unlikely in a English poem. Not impossible, but unlikely. Fraxinus ornus is frequently grown as an ornamental tree in Europe north of its native range for its decorative flowers. The species is also sometimes called flowering ash. Some cultivated specimens are grafted on rootstocks of Fraxinus excelsior, with an often very conspicuous change in the bark at the graft line to the fissured bark of the rootstock species. A sugary extract from the sap may be obtained by making a cut in the bark, which was compared in late medieval times, attested around 1400 AD, with the biblical manna, giving rise to the English name of the tree and some of the vernacular names from its native area. Fresno del Manna in Spanish, Frasino da Manna in Italian. In fact, the sugar mannose and the sugar alcohol mannitol both derive their names from the extract. Okay, since it's talking about an honey wild and manna dew, I think it must be the sugary extract from the mana ash that is being referred to. Just guesswork on my part, but that seems like the most likely explanation. Elfin is presumably the adjective the author is using for related to elves. Nowadays we're more likely to say elven, but that's been influenced by high fantasy. Is a grot an abode? Is in a grotto? A grotto, yes. Gloam. To begin to grow dark, to grow dusky, to be sullen or morose. So is that similar to gloom? Back formation of gloaming. English. Gloaming twilight darkness. Yes. It looks like gloam and gloom are cognate. Okay, that makes sense. So I will move on to the second reading. Then we will try to do an analysis of the rhyming and rhythmic scheme. Then perhaps after all that, I will consider having a quick look through the Wikipedia page for this poem. We'll move on to the final reading. And then at that point we'll probably stop there, I think. Looking at the time. So, second reading. What can ail thee, wretched wight, alone and... Oh, sorry. Let me close that. What can ail thee, wretched wight, alone and palely loitering? The sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing. What can ail thee, wretched wight, so haggard and so woebegone, with the squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest done. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheek a fading rose, fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sideways would she lean and sing a fairy's song. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me as she did love, and made sweet moan. She'd found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild and manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she gazed and sighed deep, and there I shut her wild sad eyes, so kissed to sleep. And there we slumbered on the moss, and there I dreamed, ah woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamed, on the cold hillside. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all, who cried, La belle dame sans merci, have thee in her thrall. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke and found me here on the cold hillside. And this is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering, though the sedges withered from the lake, and no birds sing. So, rhyming, loitering and sing, but white and lake obviously don't. We're white again here, but that's in a different stanza. But gone and done. But gone, on, done, un. They don't rhyme. I wonder if they're supposed to be pronounced to rhyme. Woe begone, don't, no, done. So it should be un. Woe begun. Possibly. Apparently it should be pronounced begone. But I'd be surprised if it's supposed to be and the harvest done and the harvest done. Odd. Dew and two, but brow and rose don't. Child and wild, but meads and light don't. Long and song, but steed and sing don't. Zone and moan, but head and love don't. Dew and true, but sweet and said don't. Deep and sleep, but grot and eyes don't. Betide and side do, but moss and dreamed don't. All enthrall do, but to and mercy don't. Wide and side do, but gloam and hear don't. Loitering and sing, but not hear and lake. Okay, so it's got a sort of ABCB rhyming scheme, which is interesting. Now we'll look at rhythm. So I usually begin this by counting syllables, so at the very least I can try and spot any patterns in line length before I begin looking at stress. So, I did notice when it refers to wretched white, it's quite clear, I think, that from stanza 4 onwards, this is a reply. So stanzas 1 through 3 are an inquiry from some individual that's seen someone on the road, presumably, and everything after that from 4 onwards, so that's the reply. And so wretched white is presumably the person that they've come across. It isn't, for example, the fairy woman. Anyway, where was I? So I'm getting the sense that this is supposed to be, that each stanza is supposed to be 8 syllables, 8 syllables, 8 syllables, 4. Although we can see a clear exception to that in the second stanza where we have "and the harvest's done." That's clearly 5 syllables. And her eyes were wild. But there does seems to be a strong tendency for the rest of the for the first 3 lines in any stanza to have 8 syllables. But the author seems slightly loose when it comes to the number of syllables in the final line of each stanza, though it's clearly much shorter in each case. So we could certainly say that about the rhythmic structure. Straight away, when talking about meter, alone and palely loitering, I don't think that follows any clear meter. I mean, the obvious it's 8 syllables as expected, but there just isn't a way to pronounce that sounds natural but also figures with any of the meters I'm aware of. Being 8 syllables, we can roll out the trisyllabics meters. It's clearly would have to be something like iambic pentameter or is it tetraic pentameter, something like that. Trochaic pentameter, but neither of those work. Iambic pentameter would be the most likely. That would be alone and palely loitering, which doesn't work. Trochaic pentameter wouldn't work either. Alone and palely loitering doesn't work either. So we can see that if there is a meter, it's imperfect. But as I have seen over and over again, iambic pentameter appears to be the most popular meter in English poetry. So if there had been an attempt to make this fit a meter, I would guess it would be iambic pentameter. I met a lady in the meads. That sort of works. Full beautiful, a fairy's child. Don't work quite as well. Her hair was long, her foot was light. Oh, that's a good one. That's iambic pentameter. Her hair was long, her foot was light. That is iambic pentameter. So my conclusion is that as far as rhythm is concerned, it's trying. There's a quite imperfect iambic pentameter here with... Sorry, no, it's not even pentameter. I don't know why I'm saying pentameter. This is clearly tetrameter for the first 3 stanzas, and the final line in each stanza is much more varied. So sorry about that. So meter. I think there's been an attempt to make it iambic, but that's been very loosely adhered to. And concerning rhyming, there's an ABCB rhyming scheme. That's my conclusion. With all that said, let's have a brief look at what the Wikipedia article has to say about it, and then we will move on to Pride and Prejudice. Sorry, we will have a brief look at what the Wikipedia article has to say, then we will move on to the final reading, then on to Pride and Prejudice. La Belle Dame Sans Merci, the beautiful lady without mercy. Oh, that is Mercy. Interesting. It's a ballad produced by the English poet John Keats in 1819. It's a ballad, is it? Interesting. The title was derived from the title of a 15th century poem by Alain Chartier called La Belle Dame Sans Merci. Considered an English classic, the poem is an example of Keats' poetic preoccupation with love and death. The poem is about a fairy who condemns a knight to an unpleasant fate after she seduces him with her eyes and singing. The fairy inspired several artists to paint images that became early examples of the 19th century femme fatale iconography. The poem continues to be referenced in many works of literature, music, art and film. John William Waterhouse. It's a very nice painting. The poem is simple in structure with 12 stanzas of 4 lines each in a ABCB rhyme scheme. Below are both the original and revised version of the poem. That's really all they have to say about it. Fair enough. So not much there that we hadn't already worked out. Still, I do like this poem a lot. I like the fact that it's trying to express ideas through a fantastic or mythological scene, because I think that leads to some very strong imagery, and I think it's well written. It just because it has a loose structure doesn't mean it's not well written. So I will move on to the final reading now. If anyone, if there's anything in particular you'd like to discuss about it, this poem, please leave a comment in chat, and I will look at that shortly once I have finished the final reading. What can ail thee, wretched wight? Alone and palely loitering, the sedges withered from the lake, and no birds sing. What can ail thee, wretched wight, so haggard and so woe-begone? The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest done. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheek a fading rose, fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairer's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, her eyes were wild. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sideways would she lean and sing a fairer's song. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me as she did love, and made sweet moan. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild and manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she gazed and sighed deep, and there I shut her wild sad eyes, so I kissed to sleep. And there we slumbered on the moss, and there I dreamed, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamed, on the cold hillside. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all, who cried, La Belle Dame Sans Merci, have thee in thrall. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke and found me here on the cold hillside, and this is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering, though the sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing. So, that concludes the poetry for this week. Next, we will move on to Pride and Prejudice. As usual, I will begin this section by recapping what happened in the chapters that we read last week. So in chapter 41, Lydia receives an invitation from Mrs. Forster, the wife of the colonel of the regiment, to accompany her to Brighton. Kitty is mortified that she wasn't invited. Elizabeth tries to persuade her father not to let Lydia go on account of Lydia's unguided and imprudent manner, but in vain. Elizabeth and Mr. Wickham part on civil terms, but without any inclination to see each other again, following a conversation at dinner in which Elizabeth alluded that she better understood Mr. Darcy's disposition now, after spending some time with him at Rosings. In chapter 42, the regiment leaves Meryton. Shortly thereafter, Lydia leaves too. She promises to write more frequently than she ultimately does, and when her letters do arrive, the contents seem mostly frivolous. Elizabeth learns that owing to business considerations, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner are to leave 2 weeks later than planned for their tour with Elizabeth, and could consequently go no farther than Derbyshire. In Lambton, Derbyshire, the Gardiner party decide to visit Pemberley, much to Elizabeth's initial concern, until she ascertains from a chambermaid that the family were not currently in residence. Of course, it's important to remember that Pemberley is the main residence of Mr. Darcy. Upon visiting Pemberley, Elizabeth is struck by its beauty and the apparent good taste of its owner, and also surprised by how highly the intelligent housekeeper speaks of her master. She is even more surprised than Mr. Darcy when Mr. Darcy unexpectedly appears from the road. This leads to an extended encounter in which Mr. Darcy is ill-composed but very civil. Ultimately, Mr. Darcy asks if he may introduce Elizabeth to his sister, which is a compliment of the highest kind given their relative social status, and something that Elizabeth readily accedes to. On the journey back to town, Elizabeth, in the most guarded terms, attempts to explain to the Gardiners that she has recently come into some information which indicates that Mr. Darcy's actions towards Mr. Wickham were capable of a very different construction than that previously presumed. So I don't believe they made it entirely clear which facts Elizabeth did and did not impart to the Gardiners, but she makes it, she alludes heavily to the fact that Mr. Wickham may not have been such an upstanding gentleman as previously thought, and that Mr. Darcy may not have been quite so cruel towards him as they had suspected previously, based largely upon Mr. Wickham's own testimonials. And so that is where we begin today. Elizabeth is still in Lambton for some time. I don't think we know exactly how long, but she is expecting at some point to be introduced to Mr. Darcy's sister. So, Chapter 44. Elizabeth had settled it that Mr. Darcy would bring his sister to visit her the very day after her reaching Pemberley, and was consequently resolved not to be out of sight of the inn the whole of that morning. But her conclusion was false, for on the very morning after their arrival at Lambton, these visitors came. They had been walking about the place with some of their new friends, and were just returning to the inn to dress themselves for dining with the same family, when the sound of a carriage drew them to a window, and they saw a gentleman and a lady in a curricle driving up the street. A curricle is a type of carriage. Elizabeth, immediately recognising the livery, guessed what it meant, and imparted no small degree of her surprise to her relations by acquainting them with the honour which she expected. Her uncle and aunt were all amazement, and the embarrassment of her manner as she spoke, joined to the circumstance itself, and many of the circumstances of the preceding day, opened to them a new idea on the business. Nothing had ever suggested it before, but they felt there was no other way of accounting for such attentions from such a quarter than by supposing a partiality for their niece. While these newly born notions were passing in their heads, the perturbation of Elizabeth's feelings was at every moment increasing. She was quite amazed at her own discomposure, but amongst other causes of disquiet she dreaded lest the partiality of the brother should have said too much in her favour, and more than commonly anxious to please, she naturally suspected that every power of pleasing would fail her. She retreated from the window, fearful of being seen, and as she walked up and down the room, endeavouring to compose herself, saw such looks of inquiring surprise in her uncle and aunt as made everything worse. Miss Darcy and her brother appeared, and this formidable introduction took place. With astonishment did Elizabeth see that her new acquaintance was at least as much embarrassed as herself. Since her being at Lambton, she had heard that Miss Darcy was exceedingly proud, but the observation of a very few minutes convinced her that she was only exceedingly shy. She found it difficult to obtain even a word from her beyond a monosyllable. Miss Darcy was tall, and on a larger scale than Elizabeth, and though little more than 16, her figure was formed, and her appearance womanly and graceful. She was less handsome than her brother, but there was sense and good humour in her face, and her manners were perfectly unassuming and gentle. Elizabeth, who had expected to find in her as acute and unembarrassed as observer as ever Mr. Darcy had been, Elizabeth, who had expected to find in her as acute and unembarrassed an observer as ever Mr. Darcy had been, was much relieved by discerning such different feelings. They had not long been together before Mr. Darcy told her that Bingley was also coming to wait on her, and she had barely time to express her satisfaction and prepare for such a visitor when Bingley's quick step was heard on the stairs, and in a moment he entered the room. All Elizabeth's anger against him had been long done away, but had she still felt any, it could hardly have stood its ground against the unaffected cordiality with which he expressed himself on seeing her again. He inquired in a friendly, though general way, after her family, and looked and spoke with the same good-humoured ease that he had ever done. To Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner he was scarcely a less interesting personage than to herself. They had long wished to see him. The whole party before them, indeed, excited a lively attention. The suspicions which had just arisen of Mr. Darcy and their niece directed their observations towards each with an earnest though guarded inquiry, and they soon drew from these inquiries the full conviction that one of them at least knew what it was to love. Of the lady's sensations they remained a little in doubt, but that the gentleman was overflowing with admiration was evident enough. Elizabeth, on her side, had much to do. She wanted to ascertain the feelings of each of her visitors. She wanted to compose her own, and to make herself agreeable to all, and in the latter object, where she feared most to fail, she was the most sure of success, for those to whom she endeavoured to give pleasure were prepossessed in her favour. Bingley was ready, Georgina was eager, and Darcy determined to be pleased. In seeing Bingley, her thoughts naturally flew to her sister, and oh, how ardently did she long to know whether any of his were directed in a like manner. Sometimes she could fancy he talked less than on former occasions, and once or twice pleased herself with the notion that, as he looked at her, he was trying to trace a resemblance. But though this might be imaginary, she could not be deceived as to his behaviour to Miss Darcy, who had been set up as a rival to Jane. No look appeared on either side that spoke particular regard. Nothing occurred between them that could justify the hopes of his sister. On this point she was soon satisfied, and 2 or 3 little circumstances occurred ere they parted, which in her anxious interpretation denoted a recollection of Jane not untinctured by tenderness, and a wish of saying more than that might lead to the mention of her, had he dared. He observed to her, at a moment when the others were talking together, in a tone which had something of a real regret, that it was a very long time since he had the pleasure of seeing her. Before she could reply, he added, "It is about 8 months. We've not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing together at Netherfield." Elizabeth was pleased to find his memory so exact, and he afterwards took occasion to ask her, when unattended by any of the rest, whether all her sisters were at Longbourn. There was not much in the question nor in the preceding remark, but there was a look and a manner which gave them meaning. It was not often that she could turn her eyes on Mr. Darcy himself, but whenever she did catch a glimpse, she saw an expression of general complacence, and in all that he said she heard an accent so removed from hauteur or disdain of his companions, as convinced her that the improvement of manners which she had yesterday witnessed, however temporary its existence might prove, had at least outlived one day. When she saw him thus seeking the acquaintance and courting the good opinion of people with whom any intercourse a few months ago would have been a disgrace, when she saw him thus civil, not only to herself, but to the very relations whom he had openly disdained, and recollected their last lively scene in Hunsford Parsonage, the change was so great, and struck so forcibly on her mind, that she could hardly restrain her astonishment from being visible. Never, even in the company of his dear friends at Netherfield, or his dignified relations at Rosings, had she seen him so desirous to please, so free from self-consequence or unbending reserve, as now, when no importance could result from the success of his endeavours, and when even the acquaintance of those to whom his attentions were addressed would draw down the ridicule and censure of the ladies both of Netherfield and Rosings. Their visitors stayed with them about half an hour, and when they arose to depart, Mr. Darcy called on his sister to join him in expressing their wish of seeing Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and Miss Bennet to dinner at Pemberley before they left the country. When they say left the country, I've come to the understanding that means leaving the area. There's been a fair few references to leaving the country, and I don't think they mean country in the national sense. Miss Darcy, though with a diffidence which marked her little in the habit of giving invitations, readily obeyed. Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece, desirous of knowing how she, whom the invitation most concerned, felt disposed as to its acceptance, but Elizabeth had turned away her head, presuming, however, that this studied avoidance spoke rather of momentary embarrassment than any dislike of the proposal, and seeing in her husband, who was fond of society, a perfect willingness to accept it, she ventured to engage for her attendance, and the day after the next was fixed on. Bingley expressed great pleasure in the certainty of seeing Elizabeth again, having still a great deal to say to her, and many inquiries to make after all their Hertfordshire friends. Elizabeth, construing all this into a wish of hearing her speak of her sister, was pleased, and on this account, as well as some others, found herself, when their visitors left them, capable of considering the last half hour with some satisfaction, though while it was passing, the enjoyment of it had been little. Eager to be alone, and fearful of inquiries or hints from her uncle and aunt, she stayed with them only long enough to hear their favourable opinion of Bingley, and then hurried away to dress. Interesting. So I would conclude that they had very different garments for indoor wear versus outdoor wear, and she's planning to go out at this point. Since it is completely obvious that she wouldn't have received guests in a state of even partial undress. She had no reason to fear Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner's curiosity. It was not their wish to force her communication. It was evidence that she was much better acquainted with Mr. Darcy than they had before any idea of. It was evidence that she was very much in love with her. They saw much to interest, but nothing to justify inquiry. Of Mr. Darcy it was now a matter of anxiety to think well, and as far as their acquaintance reached, there was no fault to find. They could not be untouched by his politeness, and had they drawn his character from their own feelings and his servant's report, without any reference to any other account, the circle in Hertfordshire to which he was known would not have recognised it for Mr. Darcy. There was now an interest, however, in believing the housekeeper, and they soon became sensible that the authority of a servant who had known him since he was 4 years old, and whose own manners indicated respectability, was not to be hastily rejected. Neither had anything occurred in the intelligence of their Lambton friends that could materially lessen its weight. They had nothing to accuse him of but pride. Pride he probably had, and if not, it would certainly be imputed by the inhabitants of a small market town where the family did not visit. It was acknowledged, however, that he was a liberal man, and did much good among the poor. With respect to Wickham, the travellers soon found that he was not held there in much estimation, for though the chief of his concerns with the son of his patrons were imperfectly understood, for though the chief of his concerns with the son of his patron were imperfectly understood, it was not yet a well-known fact that, on his quitting Derbyshire, he had left many debts behind him, which Mr. Darcy afterwards discharged. Oh, I understand. The son of his patron, obviously being Mr. Darcy. So I think what they're saying is, although the inhabitants of Lambton didn't know much about the relationship or the troubles between Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham, they did know that Mr. Wickham had left the area with a lot of debts, which Mr. Darcy had taken it upon himself to pay. As for Elizabeth, her thoughts were at Pemberley this evening more than the last, and the evening, though as it passed it seemed long, was not long enough to determine her feelings towards one in that mansion, and she lay awake 2 whole hours endeavouring to make them out. She certainly did not hate him. No, hatred had vanished long ago. She had almost as long been ashamed of ever feeling a dislike against him that could be so called. The respect created by the conviction of his valuable qualities, though, as first unwillingly admitted, had for some time ceased to be repugnant to her feeling, and was now heightened into somewhat of a friendlier nature by the testimonies so highly in his favour, and bringing forward his disposition in so amiable a light, which yesterday had produced. But above all, above the respect and esteem, there was a motive within her of goodwill which could not be overlooked. It was gratitude. Gratitude not merely for having once loved her, but for loving her still well enough to forgive all the petulance and acrimony of her manner in rejecting him, and all the unjust accusations accompanying her rejection. He who, she had been persuaded, would avoid her as his greatest enemy, seemed, on this accidental meeting, most eager to preserve the acquaintance, and without any indelicate display of regard, nor any peculiarity of manner, where their two selves only were concerned, was soliciting the good opinion of her friends, and bent on making her known to his sister. Such a change in a man of so much pride, exciting not only astonishment but gratitude. For to love, ardent love, it must be attributed, and as such its impression on her was of a sort to be encouraged, as by no means unpleasing, though it could not be exactly defined. She respected, she esteemed, she was grateful to him. She felt a real interest in his welfare, and she only wanted to know how far she wished that welfare to depend upon herself, and how far it would be for the happiness of both that she should employ the power, which her fancy told her she still possessed, of bringing on her the renewal of his addresses. It had been settled in the evening between the aunt and the niece that such a striking civility as Miss Darcy's in coming to see them on the very day of her arrival at Pemberley, for she had reached it only to a late breakfast, ought to be imitated, though it could not be equalled, by some exertion of politeness on their side, and consequently that it would be highly expedient to wait on her at Pemberley the following morning. They were therefore to go. Elizabeth was pleased, though when she asked herself the reason, she had very little to say in reply. Mr. Gardiner had left them soon after breakfast. The fishing scheme had been renewed the day before, and a positive engagement made of his meeting some of the gentlemen at Pemberley before noon. Chapter 45. Convinced as Elizabeth now was that Miss Bingley's dislike of her had originated in jealousy, she could not help feeling how unwelcome her appearance at Pemberley must be to her, and was curious to know with how much civility on that lady's side the acquaintance would now be renewed. On reaching the house, they were shown through the hall into the saloon, whose northern aspect rendered it delightful for summer. Its windows, opening to the ground, admitted a most refreshing view of the high woody hills behind the house, and of the beautiful oaks and Spanish chestnuts which were scattered over the intermediate lawn. In this house they were received by Miss Darcy, who was sitting there with Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. Mrs. Hurst, I believe, was the elder sister of Mr. Bingley, married, so she's Mrs. Hurst, and Miss Bingley would be the younger sister of Mr. Bingley. Now, when I say elder and younger, I mean with respect to each other. I don't know where Mr. Bingley is in that order. I don't know if he's the eldest, the middle child, or the youngest. Anyway. And the lady with whom she lived in London. Interesting, I don't remember that individual. Georgina's reception then was very civil, but attended with all the embarrassment which, though proceeding from shyness and fear of doing wrong, would easily give to those who felt themselves inferior the belief of her being proud and reserved. Mrs. Gardiner and her niece, however, did her justice and pitied her. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, by Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, they were noticed only by a curtsy, and on their being seated, a pause, awkward as such pauses must always be, succeeded for a few moments. It was first broken by Mrs. Annesley, a genteel, agreeable-looking woman, whose endeavour to introduce some kind of discourse proved her to be more truly well-bred than either of the others, and between her and Mrs. Gardiner, with occasional help from Elizabeth, the conversation was carried on. Miss Darcy looked as if she wished for courage enough to join in, and sometimes did venture a short sentence when there was least danger of its being heard. Elizabeth soon saw that she was herself closely watched by Miss Bingley, and that she could not speak a word, especially to Miss Darcy, without calling her attention. This observation would not have prevented her from trying to talk to the latter had they not been seated at an inconvenient distance, but she was not sorry to be spared the necessity of saying much. Her own thoughts were employing her. She expected every moment that some of the gentlemen would enter the room. She feared that the master of the house might be amongst them, and whether she wished or feared it most, she could scarcely determine. After sitting in this manner a quarter of an hour without hearing Miss Bingley's voice, Elizabeth was roused by receiving from her a cold inquiry after the health of her family. She answered with equal indifference and brevity, and the others said no more. The next variation which their visit afforded was produced by the entrance of the servants with cold meat, cake, and a variety of all the finest fruits in season. But this did not take place till after many a significant look and smile from Mrs. Ainsley to Miss Darcy had been given to remind her of her post. There was now employment for the whole party, for though they could not all talk, they could all eat, and the beautiful pyramids of grapes, nectarines, and peaches soon collected them round the table. While thus engaged, Elizabeth had a fair opportunity for deciding whether she most feared or wished for the appearance of Mr. Darcy, by the feeling which prevailed on his entering the room, and then, though but a moment before she had believed her wishes to be predominant, she began to regret that he came. He had been some time with Mr. Gardiner, who, with 2 or 3 other gentlemen from the house, was engaged by the river, and had left him only on learning that the ladies of the family intended a visit to Georgina that morning. No sooner did he appear than Elizabeth wisely resolved to be perfectly easy and unembarrassed, a resolution the more necessary to be made, but perhaps not the more easily kept, because she saw that the suspicions of the whole party were awakened against them, and that there was scarcely an eye which did not watch his behaviour when he first came into the room. In no countenance was attentive curiosity so strongly marked as in Miss Bingley's. In spite of the smiles which overspread her face whenever she spoke to one of its objects, so let me say that again. In no countenance was attentive curiosity so strongly marked as in Miss Bingley's, in spite of the smiles which overspread her face whenever she spoke to one of its objects, for jealousy had not yet made her desperate, and her attentions to Mr. Darcy were by no means over. Miss Darcy, on her brother's entrance, exerted herself much more to talk, and Elizabeth saw that he was anxious for his sister and herself to get acquainted. Miss Darcy, on her brother's entrance, exerted herself much more to talk, and Elizabeth saw that he was anxious for his sister, Miss Darcy, and herself to get acquainted, also Elizabeth, and forwarded as much as possible every attempt at conversation on either side. Miss Bingley saw all this likewise, and, in the imprudence of anger, took the first opportunity of saying, with sneering civility, "Pray, Miss Eliza, are not the shy militia removed from Meryton? They must be a great loss to your family." In Darcy's presence she dared not mention Wickham's name, but Elizabeth instantly comprehended that he was uppermost in her thoughts, and the various recollections connected with him gave her a moment's distress. But exerting herself vigorously to repel the ill-natured attack, she presently answered the question in a tolerable detached tone. While she spoke, an involuntary glance showed her Darcy, with a heightened complexion, earnestly looking at her, and his sister overcame with confusion and unable to lift up her eyes. Had Miss Bingley known what pain she was then giving her beloved friend, she undoubtedly would have refrained from the hint, but she had merely intended to discompose Elizabeth by bringing forward the idea of a man to whom she believed her partial, to make her betray a sensibility which might injure her in Darcy's opinion, and perhaps to remind the latter of all the follies and absurdities by which some part of her family were connected with that corps. Not a syllable had ever reached her of Miss Darcy's meditated elopement. To no creature had it been revealed, where secrecy was possible, except to Elizabeth, and from all Bingley's connections her brother was particularly anxious to conceal it. From the very wish which Elizabeth had long ago attributed to him, of their becoming hereafter her own, I'm going to have to go back a bit. To no creature had it been revealed where secrecy was possible, except to Elizabeth, and from all Bingley's connections, her brother was particularly anxious to conceal it, from the very wish which Elizabeth had long ago attributed to him, of their becoming hereafter her own. Oh, I get it. So, Mr. Darcy had tried very hard to keep Mr. Wickham and Miss Darcy's elopement secret, except to Elizabeth, because the people, that is his connections, he was trying to keep it secret from, he hoped would become Elizabeth's connections. So in other words, he wanted to marry Elizabeth, as we know. He had certainly formed such a plan, and without meaning that it should affect his endeavour to separate him from Miss Bennet, it is probable that it might add something to his lively concern for the welfare of his friend. Elizabeth's collected behaviour, however, soon quieted his emotion, and as Miss Bingley, vexed and disappointed, dared not approach nearer to Wickham, Georgina also recovered in time, though not enough to be able to speak any more. Her brother, whose eyes she feared to meet, scarcely recollected her interest in the affair, and the very circumstance which had been designed to turn his thoughts from Elizabeth seemed to have fixed them on her more and more cheerfully. Their visit did not continue long after the question and answer above mentioned, and while Mr. Darcy was attending them to their carriage, Miss Bingley was venting her feelings in criticisms of Elizabeth's person, behaviour, and dress, but Georgina would not join her. Her brother's recommendation was enough to ensure her favour. His judgment could not err, and he had spoken in such terms of Elizabeth as to leave Georgina without the power of finding her otherwise than lovely and amiable. When Darcy returned to the saloon, Miss Bingley could not help repeating to him some part of what she had been saying to his sister. "How very ill Miss Eliza Bennet looks this morning, Mr. Darcy," she cried. "I never in my life saw anyone so much altered as she is since the winter. She has grown so brown and coarse. Louisa and I were agreeing that we should not have known her again." However little Mr. Darcy might have liked such an address, he contented himself with coolly replying that he perceived no other alteration than her being rather tanned, no miraculous consequence of travelling in the summer. "For my own part," she rejoined, "I must confess that I never could see any beauty in her. Her face is so thin, her complexion has no brilliancy, and her features are not at all handsome. Her nose wants character, there is nothing marked in its lines. Her teeth are tolerable, but not out of the common way. And as for her eyes, which have sometimes been called so fine, I could never see anything extraordinary in them. They have a sharp, shrewish look, which I do not like at all, and in her air altogether there is a self-sufficiency without fashion which is intolerable." Persuaded as Miss Bingley was that Darcy admired Elizabeth, this was not the best method of recommending herself, but angry people are not always wise, and seeing him at last look somewhat nettled, she had all the success she expected. He was resolutely silent, however, and from a determination of making him speak, she continued, "I remember when we first knew her in Hertfordshire, how amazed we all were to find that she was a reputed beauty, and I particularly recollect your saying one night, after they had been dining at Netherfield, 'She a beauty? I should as soon call her mother a wit.' But afterwards she seemed to improve on you, and I believe you thought her rather pretty at one time." "Yes," replied Darcy, who could contain himself no longer, "but that was only when I first saw her, for it is many months since I have considered her as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance." He then went away, and Miss Bingley was left to all the satisfaction of having forced him to say what gave no one any pain but herself. Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth talked of all that had occurred during their visit, as they returned, except what had particularly interested them both. The look and behaviour of everybody they had seen were discussed, except of the person who had mostly engaged their attention. They talked of his sister, his friends, his house, his fruit, of everything but himself. Yet Elizabeth was longing to know what Mrs. Gardiner thought of him, and Mrs. Gardiner would have been highly gratified by her niece's beginning the subject. Chapter 46. Elizabeth had been a good deal disappointed in not finding a letter from Jane on their first arrival at Lambton, and this disappointment had been renewed on each of the mornings that had now been spent there, but on the third her repining was over, and her sister justified by the receipt of 2 letters from her at once, on one of which was marked that it had been missent elsewhere. Elizabeth was not surprised at it, as Jane had written the directions remarkably ill. They had just been preparing to walk as the letters came in, and her uncle and aunt, leaving her to enjoy them in quiet, set off by themselves. The one missent must first be attended to. It had been written 5 days ago. That is not bad for the postal service, given the limitations of the time, and that's the letter that's late. The beginning contained an account of all their little parties and engagements, with such news as the country afforded, but the latter half, which was dated a day later and written in evident agitation, gave more important intelligence. It was to this effect: "Since writing the above, dearest Lizzie, something has occurred of a most unexpected and serious nature, but I am afraid of alarming you. Be assured that we are all well. What I have to say relates to poor Lydia. An express came at 12 last night, just as we were all gone to bed, from Colonel Forster, to inform us that she was gone off to Scotland with one of his officers, to own the truth, with Wickham. Imagine our surprise. To Kitty, however, it does not seem so wholly unexpected. I'm very, very sorry. So imprudent a match on both sides, but I'm willing to hope the best, and that his character has been misunderstood. Thoughtless and indiscreet, I can easily believe him, but this step, and let us rejoice over it, marks nothing bad at heart. His choice is disinterested at least, for he must know my father can give her nothing. Our poor mother is sadly grieved. My father bears it better. How thankful I am that we never let them know what has been said against him. We must forget it ourselves. They were off Saturday night about 12, as is conjectured, but were not missed till yesterday morning at 8. The express was sent off directly. My dear Lizzie, they must have passed within 10 miles of us. Colonel Forster gives us reason to expect him here soon. Lydia left a few lines for his wife, informing her of their intentions. I must conclude, for I cannot be long from my poor mother. I am afraid you will not be able to make it out, but I hardly know what I have written." Without allowing herself time for consideration, and scarcely knowing what she felt, Elizabeth, on finishing this letter, instantly seized the other, and opening it with the utmost impatience, read as follows. It had been written a day later than the conclusion of the first. Okay, so that means that letter took 3 days to reach her. "By this time, my dearest sister, you have received my hurried letter. I wish this may be more intelligible, but though not confined for time, my head is so bewildered that I cannot answer for being coherent. Dearest Lizzie, I hardly know what I would write, but I have bad news for you, and it cannot be delayed. Imprudent as the marriage between Mr. Wickham and our poor Lydia would be, we are now anxious to be assured it had taken place. There is but too much reason to fear they are not gone to Scotland. Colonel Forster came yesterday, having left Brighton the day before, not many hours after the express. Though Lydia's short letter to Mrs. F. gave them to understand that they were going to Gretna Green, something was dropped by Denny expressing his belief that W. never intended to go there, or to marry Lydia at all, which was repeated to Colonel F., who, instantly taking the alarm, set off from B, intending to trace their route. He did trace them easily to Clapham, but no further, for on entering that place they removed into a hackney coach and dismissed the chase that brought them from Epsom. All that is known after this is that they were seen to continue the London road. I know not what to think. After making every possible inquiry on that side, London, Colonel F. came on into Hertfordshire, anxiously renewing them at all the turnpikes and at the inns in Barnet and Hatfield. Without any success, no such people had been seen to pass through. With the kindest concern he came on to Longbourn, and broke his apprehensions to us in a manner most creditable to his heart. I am sincerely grieved for him and Mrs. F., but no one can throw any blame on them. Our distress, my dear Lizzie, is very great. My father and mother believe the worst, but I cannot think so ill of him. Many circumstances might make it more eligible for them to be married privately in town than to pursue their first plan, and even if he could form such a design against a young woman of Lydia's connections, which is not likely, can I suppose her so lost to everything? Impossible. I grieve to find, however, that Colonel F. is not disposed to depend upon their marriage. He shook his head when I expressed my hopes, and said he feared W. was not a man to be trusted. My poor mother is really ill, and keeps her room. Could she exert herself, it would be better, but this is not to be expected. As to my father, I never in my life saw him so affected. Poor Kitty has anger for having concealed their attachment, but as it was a matter of confidence, one cannot wonder. I am truly glad, dearest Lizzie, that you have been spared something of these distressing scenes, but now, as the first shock is over, shall I own that I long for your return? I'm not so selfish, however, as to press for it, if inconvenient. Adieu. I take up my pen again to do what I have just told you I would not. My circumstances are such that I cannot help earnestly begging you all to come here as soon as possible. I know my dear uncle and aunt so well that I am not afraid of requesting it, though I have still something more to ask of the former. My father is going to London with Colonel Forster instantly, to try to discover her. What he means to do I am sure I know not, but his excessive distress will not allow him to pursue any measure in the best and safest way. And Colonel Forster is obliged to be at Brighton again tomorrow evening. In such an exigence, my uncle's advice and assistance would be everything in the world. He will immediately comprehend what I must feel, and rely upon his goodness. Oh, where is my uncle? Cried Elizabeth, darting from her seat as she finished the letter, in eagerness to follow him without losing a moment of the time so precious. But as she reached the door, it was opened by a servant, and Mr. Darcy appeared. Her pale face and impetuous manner made him start, and before he could recover himself to speak, she, in whose mind every idea was superseded by Lydia's situation, hastily exclaimed, I beg your pardon, but I must leave you. I must find Mr. Gardiner this moment, on business that cannot be delayed. I've not an instant to lose. Good God, what is the matter? Cried he, with more feeling than politeness. Then recollecting himself, I will not detain you a minute, but let me, or let the servant go after Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. You are not well enough. You cannot go yourself. Elizabeth hesitated, but her knees trembled under her, and she felt how little would be gained by her attempting to pursue them. Calling back the servant, therefore, she commissioned him, though in so breathless an accent as made her almost unintelligible, to fetch his master and mistress home instantly. On his quitting the room, she sat down, unable to support herself, and looking so miserably ill that it was impossible for Darcy to leave her, or to refrain from saying, in a tone of gentleness and commiseration, Let me call your maid. Is there nothing you could take to give you present relief? A glass of wine, shall I get you one? You are very ill. No, thank you, sir, she replied, endeavouring to recover herself. There is nothing the matter with me. I'm quite well. I'm only distressed by some dreadful news which I've just received from Longbourn. She burst into tears as she alluded to it, and for a few minutes could not speak another word. Darcy, in wretched suspense, could only say something indistinctly of his concern, and observe her in compassionate silence. At length she spoke again. I've just had a letter from Jane, with such dreadful news. It cannot be concealed from anyone. My younger sister has left all her friends, has eloped, has thrown herself into the power of Mr. Wickham. They have gone off together from Brighton. You know him too well to doubt the rest. She has no money, no connections, nothing that can tempt him to. She is lost forever. Darcy was fixed in astonishment. When I consider, she added in a yet more agitated voice, that I might have prevented it, I who knew what he was, had I but explained some part of it only, some part of what I learned, to my own family, had his character been known, this could not have happened. But it is all too late now. I am grieved indeed, cried Darcy, grieved, shocked, but it is certain, absolutely certain. Oh yes, they left Brighton together on Sunday night, and they were traced almost to London, but not beyond. They are certainly not gone to Scotland. And what has been done? What has been attempted to recover her? My father has gone to London, and Jane has written to beg my uncle's immediate assistance, and we shall be off, I hope, in half an hour, but nothing can be done. I know very well that nothing can be done. How is such a man to be worked on? How are they even to be discovered? I have not the smallest hope. It is every way horrible. Darcy shook his head in silent acquiescence. When my eyes were opened to his real character, oh, had I known what I ought, what I dared to do, but I knew not. I was afraid of doing too much. Wretched, wretched mistake. Darcy made no answer. He seemed scarcely to hear her, and was walking up and down the room in earnest meditation, his brow contracted, his air gloomy. Elizabeth soon observed, and instantly understood it. Her power was sinking. Everything must sink under such a proof of family weakness, such an assurance of the deepest disgrace. She could neither wonder nor condemn, but the belief of his self-conquest brought nothing consolatory to her bosom, afforded no palliation of her distress, was on the contrary exactly calculated to make her understand her own wishes, and never had she so honestly felt that she could have loved him, as now, when all love must be vain. But self, though it would intrude, could not engross her. Lydia, the humiliation, the misery she was bringing them all, soon swallowed up every private care, and covering her face with a handkerchief, Elizabeth was soon lost to everything else, and after a pause of several minutes was only recalled on a sense of her situation by the voice of her companion, who, in a manner which, though it spoke compassion, spoke likewise restraint, said, "I am afraid you have been long desiring my absence, nor have I anything to plead in excuse of my stay, but real, though unavailing concern. Would to heaven that anything could be either said or done on my part that might offer consolation to such distress, but I will not torment you with vain wishes, which may seem purposely to ask for your thanks. This unfortunate affair will, I fear, prevent my sister's having the pleasure of seeing you at Pemberley today. Oh yes, be so kind as to apologise for us to Miss Darcy. Say that urgent business calls us home immediately. Conceal the unhappy truth as long as it is possible. I know it cannot be long." He readily assured her of his secrecy, again expressed his sorrow for her distress, wished it a happier conclusion than there was at present reason to hope, and leaving his compliments for her relations with only one serious parting look, went away. As he quitted the room, Elizabeth felt how improbable it was that they should ever see each other again on such terms of cordiality as had marked their several meetings in Derbyshire, and as she threw a retrospective glance over the whole of their acquaintance, so full of contradiction and varieties, sighed at the perverseness of those feelings which would now have promoted its continuance, and would formerly have rejoiced in its termination. Gratitude and esteem are good foundations of affection. Elizabeth's change of sentiment will be neither improbable nor faulty. But if otherwise, if regard springing from such sources is unreasonable or unnatural, in comparison of what is so often described as arising on a first interview with its object, and even before two words have been exchanged, nothing can be said in her defence, except that she had given somewhat of a trial to the latter method in her partiality for Wickham, and that its ill success might, perhaps, authorise her to seek the other less interesting mode of attachment. Be that as it may, she saw him go with regret, and this early example of what Lydia's infamy must produce found additional anguish as she reflected on that wretched business. Never, since reading Jane's second letter, had she entertained a hope of Wickham's meaning to marry her. No one but Jane, she thought, could flatter herself with such an expectation. Surprise was the least of her feelings on this development. While the contents of the first letter remained in her mind, she was all surprise, all astonishment that Wickham should marry a girl whom it was impossible he could marry for money, and how Lydia could ever have attached him had appeared incomprehensible. But now it was all too natural, for such an attachment as this might have sufficient charms, and though she did not suppose Lydia to be deliberately engaging in an elopement without the intention of marriage, she had no difficulty in believing that neither her virtue nor her understanding would preserve her from falling an easy prey. She had never perceived, while the regiment was in Hertfordshire, that Lydia had any partiality for him. But she was convinced that Lydia wanted only encouragement to attach herself to anybody. Sometimes one officer, sometimes another, had been her favourite, as her attentions raised them in her opinion. Her affections had continually been fluctuating, but never without an object. The mischief of neglect and mistaken indulgence towards such a girl, oh, how acutely did she now feel it! She was wild to be at home, to hear, to see, to be upon the spot to share with Jane the cares that must now fall wholly upon her in a family so deranged, a father absent, a mother incapable of exertion, and requiring constant attendance, and though almost persuaded that nothing could be done for Lydia, her uncle's interferences seemed of the utmost importance. Until he entered the room, her impatience was severe. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner had hurried back in alarm, supposing by the servant's account that their niece was taken suddenly ill, but satisfying them instantly on that head, she eagerly communicated the cause of their summons, reading the two letters aloud and dwelling on the postscript of the last with trembling energy. Though Lydia had never been a favourite with them, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner could not but be deeply afflicted. Not Lydia only, but all were concerned in it, and after the first exclamations of surprise and horror, Mr. Gardiner promised every assistance in his power. Elizabeth, though expecting no less, thanked him with tears of gratitude, and all three being actuated by one spirit, everything relating to the journey was speedily settled. They were to be off as soon as possible. "But what is to be done about Pemberley?" cried Mrs. Gardiner. "John told us Mr. Darcy was here when you sent for us. Was it so?" "Yes, and I told him we should not be able to keep our engagement. That is all settled." "That is all settled," repeated the other, as she ran into her room to prepare. "And are they upon such terms as for her to disclose the real truth?" "Oh, that I knew how it was." But wishes were vain, or at least could only serve to amuse her in the hurry and confusion of the following hour. Had Elizabeth been at leisure to be idle, she would have remained certain that all employment was impossible to one so wretched as herself. But she had her share of business as well as her aunt, and amongst the rest were notes to be written to all their family, to all their friends at Lambton, with false excuses for their sudden departure. An hour, however, saw the whole completed, and Mr. Gardiner meanwhile having settled his account at the inn, nothing remained to be done to go. And Elizabeth, after all the misery of the morning, found herself in a shorter space of time than she could have supposed, seated in the carriage, and on the road to Longbourn. So, exciting events, it would seem. That concludes the Pride and Prejudice for this week. We will move on to the riddles. So I believe the last riddle that we looked at last week was 74. And that is, in places where mirth and good humour abound, who so welcome as I, or so commonly found? If I get among gamblers, I never am winner. Eat nothing, yet who can afford better dinner? At church of my privilege, never bait an ace, nor even to churchwarden or person give place. In verse or in prose there are a few who indite, but to me they apply ere they venture to write. In council I'm present, nor absent at tea. Nymphs who are courted by all, come and pay court to me. Then seek out my title, each spirited lover, who dares such a favourite rival discover. If I move not on four, as I usually do, you may find me on one leg, but never on two. And as I recall, the solution to that riddle is a table. It is indeed. So now we will move on to a few riddles that we haven't seen yet. Starting with 75. Ladies, a humble servant see, to whom you often bend the knee, which should I now attempt in verse, my various merits to rehearse, as how I am formed, and what contain, 'twould be too much for my weak brain. Suffice it then, if I declare, that much you trust unto my care. Nor was I ever for unjust, or ever betrayed this precious trust, for though I in your chambers dwell, what passes there I never tell. By merchants too my name is used, though often then I'm much abused. And why? Because a distant friend will not accept of what I send. Should I admit of any doubt, a further hint I now throw out, reverse my name and there remains a just reward for all your pains. Interesting. So let me read that once more. Ladies, a humble servant see, to whom you often bend the knee, but should I now attempt in verse my various merits to rehearse, as how I'm formed and what contain, 'twould be too much for my weak brain. Suffice it then if I declare, that much you trust unto my care, nor was I ever for unjust, or ever betrayed this precious trust. For though I in your chambers dwell, what passes there I never tell. By merchants too my name is used, though often then I'm much abused. And why? Because a distant friend will not accept of what I send. Should I admit of any doubt, a further hint I now throw out, reverse my name, and there remains a just reward for all your pains. It seems... Well, reversing one's name could mean two things. It could mean reversing the order of the letters, or if there's multiple words in it, it could mean reversing the order of the words. But I'm thinking it's much more likely that it's referring to reversing the letters. Of course, you could reverse the letters with multiple words as well, but it would seem more surprising if that then formed a series of valid words that made sense. But it could happen. I'm going to prefer the towel on this one. Thought about it a bit, but I cannot think of a solution, regrettably. So, if you have any ideas, then by all means put them in chat. Draw. Reward. Why didn't I think of that? They literally tell you it's a just reward for all your pains. If I'd just tried to reverse the word reward, I would have realised it's draw. I am such a fool. Okay. So, 76. Oh, this is quite a long one. All hail, you charming fair. Your enigmatic friend entreats that you'll declare on what these lines are penned. My origin's not great, my gravitation's small, my only useful state, confinement I may call. Sometimes I prove more strong than what surrounds my frame, that in destruction's throng obtains its future fame. By rich ones I am drawn from prison without grate, who thereafter with scorn despise my useless state. The vanity struck fair convert my comic form, and late have brought to bear that I should them adorn. Instead of being crowned with silver plate and ring, my body then surround with robes fit for a king. Both rich and poor I serve, to none my use deny. Your favours I deserve, fair ladies, what am I? So, all hail, ye charming fair, your enigmatic friend entreats that you'll declare on what these lines are penned. My origin's not great, my gravitation's small, my only useful state confined I may call. Sometimes I prove more strong than what surrounds my frame, that in destruction's throng obtains its future fame. By rich ones I am drawn from prison without grate, who afterwards with scorn despise my useless state. The vanity struck fair convert my conic form, conic, not comic, conic form, and later brought to bear that I should them adorn. So it's conical and is worn, presumably. Instead of being crowned with silver plate and ring, my body they surround with robes fit for a king. Both rich and poor I serve, to none my use deny. Your favours I deserve, fair ladies, what am I? The only thing I can think of, if it's something like a corset, it's not quite conical. It certainly doesn't come to a point, but I could certainly imagine, depending upon the silhouette you were going for, it might be broader at the bottom than at the top. And that would explain my only useful state, confinement I may call, in the sense that it's confining the individual wearing it. Not that that was the point, of course, but still. Sometimes I prove more strong than what surrounds my frame, that indestruction's throng obtains its future name. Whalebone? As in whalebone, what do they call it? I was gonna say something like lining, but it's got a proper name, doesn't it? The whalebone supports they put inside corsets. By rich ones I am drawn from prison without great, who afterwards with scorn despise my useless state. Vanity struck fair, convert my conic form, and later brought to bear that I should them adorn. Instead of being crowned with silver plate and ring, my body they surround with robes fit for a king. Both rich and poor I serve, to none my use deny. Your favours I deserve, fair ladies, what am I? I really don't know, but that's the only thing I can think. I'm probably wrong, though. I'm probably a long way off. A cork. Interesting. All hail, you charming fair, your enigmatic friend, and truths that you'll declare on what these lines are penned. My origin not great, my gravitation small, my only useful state, confinement I may call, confining a drink. Sometimes I prove more strong than what surrounds my frame, that indestruction's throng obtains its future name. I'm not sure what that refers to, but rich ones I am drawn from prison without great, who afterwards with scorn despise my useless state. The vanity struck fair, convert my conic form, and late have brought to bear that I should them adorn. Oh, so they were wearing cork? I did not know that. Huh. If I've understood that correctly. Instead of being crowned with silver plate and ring, my body they surround with robes fit for a king. Again, I don't get it. Both rich and poor I serve, to none my use deny. Your favours I deserve, fair ladies, what am I? Yep, I did not get that. Even now there's parts of this that I find confusing. Interesting though. So I wonder if cork was being used for dress purposes for some reason. Because they say surround with, they obviously refer to adorn, and they also say about surround with robes fit for a king. Was cork a material they were using in the manufacture of some clothing or something? I don't know. And finally, 77. I have two bodies to your view displayed, both of one substance uniformly made, alike in form, with one food only fed. Nor does that food consist of meat or bread, but once united they are both supplied with food which lasts until they are destroyed. When one has much, the other's share is small. Sometimes have both alike, alternate not at all. Alternate not at all. Alternate none at all. Like governed states, have many ups and downs, but mostly stand unmoved when midnight frowns. Like desperate thieves, their bodies are confined. No pain they feel, or pain they do not mind. They oft tell lies, although they have no tongue. But then the fault's not theirs when they are wrong. What they do tell should be by all much prized. Instead of that, by most it is despised. Whenever they they're moved by man's superior power, thousands unnumbered fall within an hour. Surely this must be a sand timer. What's it called? An hourglass. That's the term I was looking for. I have 2 bodies to your view displayed, both of one substance uniformly made, like in form, with one food only fed, nor does the food consist of meat or bread. When once united, they are both supplied with food which lasts until they are destroyed. When one is much, the other share is small. Sometimes have both alike, alternate none at all. Like governed states, have many ups and downs, but mostly stand unmoved when midnight frowns. Like desperate thieves, their bodies are confined. No pain they feel, or pain they do not mind. They oft tell lies, although they have no tongue. But then the fault's not theirs when they are wrong. What they do tell should be by all much prized. Instead of that, by most it is despised. Whenever they are moved by man's superior power, thousands unnumbered fall within an hour. It surely must be an hourglass. Yes. That was a quick one. We can do one more. 78. Though now I step in princely habit forth, to poverty and rags I owe my birth. Of innocence the emblem I remained, till man's vile art my native beauty stained. Now in revenge the talents I receive, gainst him I turn, and flatter and deceive. With prudence used, the world may bless my power, spleen I prevent, and gild the social hour. For when my votaries, I have no idea what that is. Consecrated by a vow or promise, consequent on a vow, devoted promise. But when my votaries without this care, with me engage, retire, ye gentle fair, while joys give place to rage and fell despair. I neither smell, nor taste, nor hear, nor see, of neither sex, yet either seem to be. And men and maids profess their love for me, nay, widows too, a fond attachment own, hoping sweet solace for dear husband gone. Possessed you'll find me of the wanton's wiles, her patches, paint, and heart beguiling smiles. My lovers now I raise, and now depress, now kill with frowns, and now with favour bless. Strange though it be, and passing strange yet more, the poor I oft make rich, the rich make poor. Attire of various kinds and sorts I wear, and yet this fantastic garb, though all the year, yet though so oddly dressed, admission find among the gayest circles of mankind. But strange caprice, whatever seen before, so fashion rules, I find access no more. Though now I step in princely habit forth, to poverty and rags I owe my birth. Of innocence the emblem I remain, till man's vile art my native beauty stained. Now in revenge the talents I receive, against him I turn, and flatter and deceive. With prudence used, the world may bless my power, spleen I prevent, and gild the social hour. Guiled? Gild? To cover with a thin layer of gold. Oh, to gild. Okay. Spleen I prevent. Fit of immoderate laughter or merriment, melancholy, hypochondriacal affections, a sudden motion or action, a fit, a freak, a whim, archaic except in the set phrase to vent one's spleen, a bad mood and spitefulness. So it could mean many things. But when my votaries without this care, with me engage, retire, ye gentle fair. My old joys give place to rage and fell despair, and neither smell nor taste nor hear nor see, of neither sex yet either seem to be. And men and maids profess their love for me, nay widows too a fond attachment own, hoping sweet solace for dear husband gone. Possessed you'll find me of the wanton's wiles, of patches pain and heart beguiling smiles. My lovers now I raise and now depress, now kill with frowns and now with favour bless. Strange though it be, and passing strange yet more, the poor I oft make rich, the rich make poor. A tower of various kinds and sorts I wear, this fantastic garb for all the years, and yet though so oddly dressed, admission find amongst the gayest circles of mankind. But strange caprice, whatever seen before, so fashion rules I find access no more. Wine? Maybe? Though now I step in princely habit forth, to poverty and rags I owe my birth. Of innocence the emblem I remained, till man's vile art my native beauty stained. And in revenge the talents I received, gainst in my turn and flatter and deceive. With prudence used, the world may bless my power, spleen I prevent and gild the social hour. But when my votaries without this care, with me engage, retire, ye gentle fair. My old joys give place to rage and fell despair. I neither smell nor taste nor hear nor see, of neither sex yet either seem to be. And men and maids profess their love for me, they widows too a fond attachment own, hoping sweet solace for dear husband gone. Possessed you'll find me of the wanton's wiles. Oh, what was wanton? Undisciplined, unruly, not able to be controlled. Playful, sportive, merry or carefree. Lewd, immoral, sexually open, unchaste. Capricious, reckless of morality, justice. Acting without regard for law or the well-being of others. Oh, yeah, as in the legal sense. Extravagant, unrestrained, excessive. I want to double check fell as well. I'm pretty sure both those words we've looked up before. Of a strong and cruel nature, eager and unsparing, grim, fierce, ruthless, savage, one fell swoop. From Middle English, strong, fierce, terrible, cruel. Cruel, savage, fierce. Okay. Oh, see, felon. Interesting. Where was I? I think I just read, possessed you'll find me of the wanton's wiles, a patch's paint and heart beguiling smiles. My lovers now I raise and now depress, now kill with frowns and now with favour bless. Strange though it be, and passing strange yet more, the poor off make rich, the rich make poor. Torrefair's kind to the sorts I wear, and this fantastic garb, through all the years, yet though so oddly dressed, admission find amongst the gayest circles of mankind, but strange caprice, wherever seen before, so fashion rules I find access no more. My best guess is wine, because there are different varieties of wine, which may go in or out of fashion. Makes sense with the connection to human emotions, that it can help act as a social lubricant, it can induce rages, etc. in theory, or at least it can induce a an insensibility which could lead to someone becoming enraged. A pack of cards. Oh, that makes more sense. Or at least it certainly figures with the making people rich or poor. Though now I step in princely habit forth to poverty and rags I owe my birth. I don't know that that's true. I'd thought cards had actually come... I could be wrong. I've got a vague feeling playing cards came via Egypt originally. But they were originally... Like, I understand playing cards and tarot cards have a common ancestor, which I think came via Egypt. And so they originally had a bit of a dual purpose as both something to game with and potentially was had some connection to mysticism. That was my understanding, and that doesn't necessarily figure with coming from poverty and rags. Could be wrong though, that's just my vague recollections. Of innocency emblem I remained, till man's vile art my native beauty stained. That makes sense. Now in revenge the talents I receive, gainst him I turn and flatter and deceive. With prudence used, the world may bless my power, spleen I prevent and gild the social hour. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But when my votaries, without this care, without me engage, retire, ye gentle fair, my old joys give place to rage and fell despair. I neither smell nor taste nor hear nor see, of neither sex, yet either seem to be. And men and maids profess their love for me, nay widows too a fond attachment own, hoping sweet solace for their husband gone. Possessed you'll find me of the wanton's wiles, at patches paint and heart beguiling smiles. So the playing cards can seduce. My lovers now I raise and now depressed, now kill with frowns and now with favours bless. That makes more sense now. Strange though it be, and passing strange yet more, the poor I oft make rich, the rich make poor. Attire of various kinds and sorts I wear, and this fantastic garb for all the year. Yet though so oddly dressed, admission find amongst the gayest circles of mankind. But strange caprice wherever seen before, so fashion rules I find access no more. Okay, that was a much better one than I thought it was going to be. So, that concludes the stream for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. That is the poetry, prose and riddles stream for this week. I'll be streaming again on Friday. No, I won't. This Friday is cancelled. I'll be streaming again this Saturday. I expect from 4. That will have to be confirmed. But I'm moderately confident Saturdays will be going ahead, whereas I'm really quite confident that... Well, I'm certain that Fridays won't be going ahead at this point. Saturdays probably will, but not definitely. So perhaps I should put it this way. I stream on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and most Saturdays. On Mondays, Fridays, and if I do a Saturday, I do some sort of gaming. Currently, I'm playing through the game Stray. On Wednesdays, I do poetry, prose, and riddles. All streams are from 4 o'clock. This Friday stream is cancelled. Saturdays will probably be going ahead, but I can't absolutely confirm it at this point. After this Saturday, definitely streaming should just resume as usual. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and most Saturdays. We will raid a Heyohina. So I'll just get that set up. Okay, so once again, thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll see you next time, I suppose. Bye.